Okay, the components in the kit, we get you new lower A-arms that have a higher clearance to them. They're also chrome moly, so they're very strong. You get new spindles and upper A-arms. The upper A-arms are a forged aluminum version, which is a lot stronger than stock. You can just simply see in the comparison between the stock and the forged version. The forged aluminum version is much stronger. Same with the spindles. The spindles are less weight and being shorter. It's also a forged aluminum spindle, which is very strong. To complete the kit, you've got new mounting brackets, which for the upper A-arms, which mount to the bulkhead stiffeners for strength. We give you all the hardware that's required, from the bolts to the rivets, new upper A-arm bolts, and then the ball joints to the end of the A-arm. To remove the bumper, simply remove the 4 torque screws, 2 on each side. Unless you have a limited model, then there is a lower mount that needs to be unbolted as well. Okay, next we'll be removing the exhaust manifold. Starting off, we'll remove the heat shield. We already had the 2 screws already loosened up for the heat shield, and that simply pulls out. Remove the ECU. We've already loosened up or removed the 2 bolts for the crossbar on both sides to speed up the process here. On 6000 models, the air sensor needs to be removed, and then on the 800cc models, this is not there, so it's nothing to worry about. This is only for the 6000 models. Remove from the throttle bodies. The nuts and the manifold have already been loosened up ahead of time. Okay, next we will be removing the throttle bodies, or pulling them out of place. On the 6000 models, the throttle bodies will stay on the machine. We'll just be pulling them up. Starting off by removing the throttle cable. Pull back the air intake. On the 6000 models, you just push the throttle bodies up on top of the reed valve area, and then we just use a rubber strap to kind of hold them in place. The 6000 model has the rubber ground on the back side and the rubber boot on the front side. Pull the boot out of the way and pull the intake out of the way. On the 8000 models, that rubber boot is built into the intake, so that would stay on there. If you have an 800 or 8000 model, typically would remove the throttle bodies all the way off. You can just simply remove the coolant line on the left side and the right side, and just put a bolt or a plug in each side of it to keep the coolant from draining out. Or if you were doing a big bore kit, this would be a good time to just drain the coolant from the motor.
The first thing you want to do is get all of the major bolts loosened up. So what we're going to do is we're going to loosen this one here up with an 18mm wrench. Then we're going to take the lower ball joint nut off. We'll be saving that, so we'll just keep that there. And then what next thing we're going to do is take the tie rod end bolt here, and that'll take a 13mm on the top, a 15 on the bottom, and you're going to loosen it up, and then have it so that it is loose like this here, so it ends up still on there, because you want to keep the upper spindle, you want to keep it stabilized. Our next thing we're going to do is we're going to go to the upper control arm, and we're going to take a 40 Torex. And this has got a triangle nut in here, so you don't need a wrench in there, but you're going to take it and take the nut off of there and then lift up on it, and you're going to be saving the components here. So our next thing now is to take the tie rod end off here, totally off of the spindle. So you're going to take this 15 millimeter nut off and just rotate this a little bit, lift it up. There is a washer there, make sure that stays to the top side before you put it onto your next spindle there, but you're going to just put your nut back on to save it. So now we're going to take the spindle off of the lower control arm. And what we do here is we take this, rotate the ski all the way over, and we take a hammer and right in this area.
Okay, next we will be removing the upper A-arm. It's an 8 millimeter bolt with a 10 millimeter nut. Remove the bolts, remove the A-arm and the bushings. Okay, the upper A-arm mounts are removed. There's a front one and a rear one on each side. Simply, we already loosened up the bolts on this one. Okay, using either a pick or a flathead screwdriver, we're going to remove the two threaded clips that hold the bumper on. And we'll go over to the workbench here. This is the strengthener bracket that's used. So a clip is added to the strengthener bracket. Down to lock the clip into place. Okay, before the upper A-arm mount is installed, we need to drill out a couple bulkhead rivets. This top one, and there's also this bottom one. Okay, now that the two rivets have been drilled out with the 3/16 drill bit, we'll be installing the strengthener bracket using the countersunk bolts through the top and then 10 millimeter nuts to fasten things into place. Okay, we'll be installing the upper A-arm mount next, using the torque style bolts with nuts and then a countersunk to screw in the back side of the bracket. Put the nut on the Torx bolt on the back side. Install the second Torx bolt and nut. Don't forget the washers. And then the countersunk bolt goes in the front, which threads right into the lower part of the front of the bracket. Okay, now we just simply need to tighten up some of the bolts for the stiffener bracket and the upper mounting bracket. Okay, next we just need to drill out some holes for the mounting bracket. On the left side, you got the front one here, and then the two in the rear. We already have the right side bracket installed, but on the right side bracket there would be 4 holes that you would have to drill out, which would be the bottom left, top left, the one next to it, and then this front one. You can see all the hardware is already installed in this one at this point. This is a 1/4 inch drill bit at this point. So that's the 3 on the left side, and then normally you would do the right hand side next where the 4 holes were that I pointed out previously. Alright, the hardware used is we got 2 countersunk bolts and 1 Torx. Countersunk in the bottom right, countersunk in the front lower left, and the Torx in the back upper right. And using the lock nuts and washers. Install the nuts on the 2 rear bolts. And the front bolt. You can see we've already done that on the other side. All the hardware is already installed and tightened. Okay, before you install the rivets, you need to remember to drill through the stiffener mount on the back side here. Okay, on both sides, the mounting bracket has 5 rivets, which is actually 3 on the bracket, and then 1 above, 1 below we had drilled out previously, and then the 3 on the bracket. You can see that we've already drilled and installed the rivets. 1, 2, 3 on the bracket, the upper one, and the lower. Okay, if you are going to be installing the 36-inch wide front end and replacing the lower A-arms, we'll begin that process. Just by removing the front skid plate here, there's 4 Torx bolts that need to be removed to remove the short skid plate protector. 2 in the rear, and there's 2 in the front. Okay, we need to loosen up the rubber boot for the tie rod. There are 6 push pins that need to be removed, 6 total. There's 1 in the bottom left here, and then 5 more in the front. Just take a flathead screwdriver and just simply pop it out, and then grab a pliers to remove the push pin, and do that to all 6 of those push pins. Okay, now that the push pins have been removed, you pull the boot back, and there's a 13 millimeter headed bolt and a 15 millimeter nut, and then there's a 15 millimeter headed bolt right there. Now you simply loosen up the back bolt and nut, and then the front one, we actually loosen this one up ahead of time. You can see there's a nut. There was a nut on the inside, but this bracket holds it in place, so you don't have to put a wrench on it when you loosen it. Pull the bushings out of the A-arm and make sure you hold on to the bushings, because you'll be reusing those, and pull the A-arm through the boot. Okay, so we're going to be installing the new high clearance A-arm. Make sure when you put the stock bushings back in, you put the lip to the outside. And just reinstall the rear bolt. And then the front bolt. Nut goes into place in the front. Nut on the bolt in the rear. And then tighten up both of those bolts. Okay, now we're going to remove the tie rod. Just simply take a 9/16 wrench, and it simply unthreads. Okay, now we're going to go to the narrower, shorter tie rod for the 36-inch wide front end. Just simply take the new tie rod and thread it onto the joint, the ball joint threads. Okay, now we just are going to be installing the upper A-arm. This is for the 36-inch wide front end. If you are getting the complete front end, the kit would come with new ball joints. If you already had a 36-inch front end and you're just changing the spindles and the A-arms, then just take the stock ball joints and nut off of your stock upper A-arm and transfer it over to the new forged aluminum upper A-arm. Put the bushings back into the upper mount. Put the A-arm into place. Put the bolt and nut into place on both front and rear, and then tighten them up. Okay, for the 36-inch front end, we'll be installing the spindle. Starting from the bottom. Bolt the top on. Tie rod in. Make sure that you put the washer on top there and the nut on the bottom. Alright, to tighten up the bottom nut, you need to put pressure on the A-arm using a bar. Simply tighten up the nut, and then tighten up the upper nut next. Alright, when you're doing your alignment on your skis, the toe alignment, just simply remove the ball joint from the spindle and then loosen up the lock nut for the ball joint. Just use a 9/16 wrench on the tie rod, and then you can see how you can just simply adjust the ball joint once you got the correct toe setting set. Lock the lock nut, and then make sure when you are all done that you double check all of the nuts and bolts that we've changed out. You know, double check your spindle nuts, your A-arm bolt. You can see we've actually put the rubber boot back on, put all the push pins back into place, and then of course make sure your lower bolts were all tightened as well. Put the lower bulkhead protector back on, skid plate with the 4 bolts. Actually you want to do the 2 rear, and then when you do the bumper installation, the bumper, it depends on what bumper you have. If you have like a limited model or an aftermarket bumper, a lot of times it'll use the lower bolt will go through the bumper and the skid plate, and then up top, you know, the bolt would go through the bulkhead there to hold the bumper on. Once the bumper's on, that's when you would go back to putting the hood back on into place. After the front suspension has been installed, then reverse the process of disassembly. First putting in the throttle bodies along with the airbox, the ECU, throttle cable, and the heat shield. Alright, well here's your final product. Here's a machine with the 36-inch wide lightweight front end installed. It's got the Zebros high clearance lower A-arms. You can see the forged upper A-arms are in place. Our spindles are in place. We've already done our alignment. One thing that we have really found that works well with the front end is the SLP Mohawk skis. They're a really good choice to use along with our front end. We just have found that ski to be a great ski for all applications of mountain riding and powder riding. You'll be able to see here, nice view from the front with the high clearance A-arms. Just lots more clearance. Everything is in place, and you are ready to ride.